For a while now, Amazon has been a one-stop shop, an online store where you can buy just about anything. But it wasn't always that way. When the company first started, it was just a bookstore. The question that's always bothered me is, why books? Of all the products they could have sold on the early internet, electronics, clothing, or household goods, why did Amazon choose something as specific as books? Before Amazon even existed as a public company, Jeff Bezos was a senior vice president at a hedge fund when he encountered a statistic that immediately caught his attention. Internet usage was growing at roughly 2,300% per year. For most industries, even 20% annual growth would be considered extraordinary. A number like 2,300% suggested something very different. It suggested a technology expanding so quickly that entirely new industries might form around it. Bezos began studying what kinds of products could realistically be sold through an online catalog. The list included around 20 categories, but one stood out immediately: books. Books had several properties that made them unusually compatible with the early internet. They were standardized products where every copy of a title was identical, meaning customers didn't need to expect the item before purchasing it. They were durable and relatively easy to ship, and most importantly, the number of books in existence is enormous. A large physical bookstore might carry 100,000 titles if it devoted an entire building to inventory, but global publishing catalogs contained millions of titles. Physical stores had to constantly decide which books deserved shelf space and which would never appear in the store at all. But an online store didn't have that constraint. Instead of shelves, it could rely on a database, and a database doesn't care whether it contains 1,000 products or 10 million. The theory was that an online bookstore could offer a selection vastly larger than any physical retailer simply by connecting customers to existing distributors. But recognizing the opportunity created a personal decision. Bezos already had a highly successful career in finance, and leaving that position to start an internet bookstore in the mid-1990s didn't appear rational to most people. So he approached the decision analytically. He imagined himself at 80 years old looking back on his life and asked which choice he would regret more: attempting an internet startup that might fail, or staying in finance while watching the internet transform the economy without him. Failure, he reasoned, would not be particularly painful decades later, but missing the opportunity entirely almost certainly would be. Bezos later called this thought experiment the regret minimization framework, and it led him to leave his career in hedge funds to start an online retail company. He and his wife Mackenzie Scott moved to Seattle, the home of Microsoft and a city with strong engineering talent. At the time, it was also very close to some major book distributors. During the drive across the United States, Bezos drafted the early version of the company's business plan. The company was briefly named Cadabra before Bezos changed it to Amazon, referencing the world's largest river and reflecting his ambition to build the largest bookstore on Earth. When Amazon launched its website in July 1995, operations were still extremely small. The company worked out of a rented house in Bellevue, Washington, where the garage served as the first packing and shipping area. Early employees built makeshift packing tables from wooden doors placed on sawhorses, while orders were processed through a newly built website designed by the company's first engineer, Shel Kafan. From the customer's perspective, the system looked surprisingly polished. Visitors could search for books, read descriptions, and place orders through a simple interface. But behind the scenes, many processes were still manual. Employees often ordered books from distributors only after a customer placed a purchase and then packed the shipment once the inventory arrived. Despite these improvised systems, something important began happening almost immediately after the site launched. Orders began arriving from all across the United States. Within weeks, Amazon was shipping books to customers in all 50 states and dozens of other countries. The internet had removed the geographic limits that defined traditional retail. But offering millions of titles created another problem. Customers needed a way to discover books they didn't already know existed. Amazon addressed this with one of its earliest technological innovations, a recommendation system based on patterns in customer purchases. If large numbers of people bought two books together, the system could identify that relationship and suggest the second book to future customers browsing the first. This eventually became the feature labeled "Customers who bought this also bought. Instead of relying on store employees to recommend books, Amazon used data generated by customer behavior. Each purchase created information that improved future recommendations, turning the store into a system that gradually learned from its users. Towards the end of the 1990s, it was clear that the gamble Bezos took to start an online bookstore had proved successful. The company was thriving, and it wouldn't be long before they expanded past books and into other markets as well. But success attracts attention, and before Amazon could begin to widen their retail offering, a particular competitor was determined to cause them trouble: the world's largest bookstore. In the late 1990s, that was Amazon's slogan. The claim was bold, and according to one of the largest bookstore chains in the United States, Barnes & Noble, it was also false. Just days before Amazon's IPO in 1997, Barnes & Noble filed the lawsuit arguing that Amazon could not possibly be the world's largest bookstore because it did not actually stock most of the books it sold. Instead, they claimed, Amazon was simply acting as a broker between customers and book distributors. But ironically, that criticism unintentionally highlighted Amazon's primary competitive advantage. It was precisely because Amazon didn't work like a classic retailer that it could scale bigger, provide more, and deliver faster than any other company. The lawsuit was eventually settled out of court, but it revealed something important. Amazon was no longer a small experiment in online retail. It had become a real threat to the companies that had dominated the bookstore industry for decades. Just days after the lawsuit, Amazon moved forward with its IPO, pricing shares at $18 and eventually raising $54 million. At the time, the company was still losing money, which raised doubts among analysts, but Bezos made it clear in his first shareholder letter that Amazon would prioritize long-term market leadership over short-term profit. The company would reinvest heavily into warehouses, software systems, and customer experience rather than aiming for immediate earnings. Bezos wanted Amazon to be the best before it became the richest. However, that strategy soon faced its first major test. By the late 1990s, investors had poured enormous amounts of capital into internet startups. Many of these companies had ambitious ideas but little operational infrastructure. When the dot-com bubble collapsed in 2000, hundreds of internet businesses disappeared almost overnight. While companies like Pets.com vanished within months, Amazon didn't just survive, they continued to grow. The reason was that while many startups focused primarily on marketing and investor enthusiasm, Amazon had spent its capital building logistics networks, fulfillment systems, and a large base of customers. It had built a functioning retail machine rather than simply a website. But the system they built wasn't limited to Amazon itself. The company had quietly developed the parts required to run online commerce at national scale: warehouses, distribution networks, recommendation algorithms, and software capable of managing an enormous catalog of products. Once that infrastructure existed, a new possibility began to emerge. If Amazon already had the technology and logistics required to run a massive online store, then perhaps that system didn't need to sell only Amazon's own products. Other businesses could potentially use the same tools. And that idea would eventually transform Amazon from a retailer into something much larger. Because once thousands of independent sellers began plugging into the system, Amazon would no longer just be a store, it would become a platform. In traditional retail, companies usually try to eliminate competitors, not invite them onto their own shelves. But in the early 2000s, something unusual started happening on Amazon. You could search for a product, and the seller might be a small electronic shop in another state, or a company importing products from overseas. Sometimes it was a business you had never even heard of before. The purchase still happened through Amazon, the payment still went through their website, and in many cases, the package that arrived on your doorstep even came in an Amazon box. The company had begun a shift into an entirely new direction. It had built a platform where thousands of independent sellers could plug directly into their site and sell products to the same people who until now were purchasing directly from Amazon. But why would a successful retail company apparently choose to give away one of their most valuable assets? Their customers. To understand what was happening, we have to go back to the year 2000. Amazon had just survived the collapse of the dot-com bubble. Hundreds of internet startups had disappeared almost overnight, but Amazon had managed to stay alive largely because it had spent the previous few years building something many of its competitors ignored: real infrastructure. They had warehouses, logistics systems, catalog software, and recommendation algorithms already in place. It wasn't just a website, it was a complete retail ecosystem. At that moment, the company faced a decision. Amazon could continue operating like a traditional retailer, buying products itself and selling them to customers. But Bezos and his team realized something about the system they had already built. The website attracted traffic, the warehouses handled shipping, and the software managed millions of products. None of that infrastructure actually required Amazon to own every item being sold. As he had shown with the initial idea to become the largest bookstore in the world, Bezos believed that selection was the most important factor in online retail. The more products a store offered, the more reasons customers had to shop there. But Amazon could never afford to buy and store everything. So, in November of 2000, combining the existing infrastructure with the desire to provide an endless selection of products, Amazon launched a feature called Amazon Marketplace. For the first time, independent businesses could list their products directly on Amazon's website. The idea seems simple. A seller with inventory could upload a product listing and offer it alongside Amazon's own version of the same item. When a customer searched for that product, both options might appear on the same page. But this small change introduced a completely new structure for the company, because now Amazon was doing two things at once. It was still a retailer selling its own products, but it was also becoming something else entirely, a platform that other businesses could use to reach customers. Of course, Amazon earned a fee on each of those sales, meaning the company profited from transactions without needing to own the inventory itself. But in truth, Amazon wasn't actually giving away its customers. It was turning competitors into suppliers. Once that system existed, a powerful feedback loop began to form. A flywheel is a heavy wheel that takes effort to start spinning, but becomes increasingly powerful as its momentum builds. Jeff Bezos used the flywheel as a metaphor to explain what Amazon was doing. A larger selection improves customer experience. Better customer experience attracts more shoppers attracts more sellers, and more sellers expands selection. Once that wheel started spinning, it became extremely difficult to stop. By the mid-2000s, Amazon's marketplace was beginning to grow quickly. More sellers were joining the platform, which meant more products were appearing on the site every day. But there was still one major problem Amazon hadn't solved yet: shipping. At the time, ordering products online, regardless of the site a customer purchased from, often meant waiting a week or more for delivery. Most importantly, for customers used to walking into a physical store and leaving with a product immediately, that delay was one of the biggest barriers to online shopping. So, in 2005, Amazon introduced a new idea called Amazon Prime. For an annual fee of $79, customers could receive unlimited 2-day shipping on eligible items being sold directly from Amazon. At first, the offer seemed almost irrational. Fast shipping was expensive, and offering it on unlimited orders looked like a service that might lose money. But the real goal wasn't shipping, it was behavior. Once customers paid for Prime, the psychology of shopping changed. Instead of comparing prices across multiple websites, many customers began starting their search directly on Amazon, partly because they wanted to make the most of the subscription they had already paid for. That change had a powerful effect on the marketplace. More Prime members meant more orders flowing through Amazon, more orders made the platform more attractive for sellers, and as more sellers joined the system, the selection of products grew even larger. The flywheel began spinning even faster. While the introduction of Marketplace and Prime were both major improvements for customers, the combination of the two programs created a unique challenge for Amazon. Prime had changed what shoppers expected. Fast, reliable 2-day shipping was quickly becoming the standard, but Amazon could only guarantee that speed for products it sold directly, while third-party sellers were still responsible for storing their own inventory and shipping orders themselves. That meant delivery speeds on Amazon could vary widely depending on the seller, and the customer experience wasn't always consistent. For a company obsessed with reliability and fast delivery, that was a problem. So Amazon introduced another idea that would deepen the platform even further. In 2006, the company launched a program called Fulfillment by Amazon, often shortened to FBA. Instead of shipping orders themselves, sellers could pay a fee to send their inventory directly to Amazon's warehouses. And from that point on, Amazon handled the storage, packaging, shipping, and even the customer service for those products. This meant that to customers browsing the website, the difference between buying directly from Amazon and buying from a third-party seller was almost invisible. A product sold by an independent business would still arrive in an Amazon box, shipped from an Amazon warehouse, following the same delivery timelines as Amazon's own products. But behind the scenes, something important had changed. Amazon wasn't just hosting other sellers anymore. It was now operating the logistics network that allowed their businesses to function. This also meant that once sellers began relying on Amazon's warehouses and delivery systems, leaving the platform became much more difficult. Just like that, they were now providing both the digital and physical infrastructure for the sellers on their site. In other words, the company had evolved from simply providing a marketplace into a retail machine that powered thousands of online businesses. As programs like Marketplace, Prime, and Fulfillment by Amazon expanded, more businesses began building themselves directly on top of Amazon's system. A small company no longer needed to build its own website, negotiate shipping contracts, or operate its own warehouses. Amazon already had those pieces in place. All a seller needed was a product and the ability to plug into the platform. That made the system incredibly attractive, and over time, this led to a major shift in how online retail worked. Many businesses were no longer competing against Amazon. They were operating inside it. Amazon still looked like a store from the outside. Customers visited the website, searched for products, and placed orders just like they always had. But behind that simple interface, the company had become something much larger. It was a marketplace, a logistics network, and a customer gateway all operating at the same time. To put it another way, Amazon had quietly built the operating system for online commerce. Millions of businesses now depended on it to reach customers, move products, and run their operations. But building a system this large created another challenge for Amazon. Because running a platform that coordinated warehouses, sellers, orders, and deliveries across the globe required an enormous amount of technology. They needed databases to track millions of products, software to manage inventory moving between warehouses, and servers to process an endless stream of customer requests every second. Over time, Amazon's engineers built hundreds of internal tools just to keep the company running. Those systems were initially built to power Amazon itself, but eventually they realized that many of the problems Amazon was solving weren't unique to Amazon. Other companies also needed servers, storage, and software capable of running a large-scale online platform. So in 2006, the company made another decision that seemed almost as strange as inviting competitors into its store. It started selling its own internal technology to other businesses. This move would eventually grow into one of the most important pieces of infrastructure on the entire internet. The company that began as an online bookstore was now building the digital infrastructure that thousands of other companies would depend on. That transformation would lead to the next phase of Amazon's evolution, because the next time Amazon expanded, it wasn't just retailers plugging into the system, it was the internet itself. If you ask most people how Amazon makes its money, the answer seems obvious. After all, Amazon looks like the ultimate online store. Basically, anything you can buy, whether it's digital or physical, Amazon has it. But the strange part is this: selling all of that isn't where Amazon really makes its money. Behind the shopping carts and delivery trucks, there's another part of the company doing something completely different. Instead of shipping boxes, it rents out computing power, data storage, and the digital infrastructure that thousands of other companies rely on to run their businesses. In 2025, that division, Amazon Web Services, generated about $45.6 billion in operating income. That's out of roughly $80 billion for the entire company. In other words, more than half of Amazon's profits weren't coming from selling products, they were coming from servers, which raises a strange question. How did a company that started as an online bookstore end up quietly becoming the company that runs much of the internet? By the early 2000s, Amazon had grown into an incredibly complex operation. Customers were visiting the site in massive numbers, independent sellers were listing products through the marketplace, warehouses were constantly receiving shipments, sorting inventory, and sending packages back out across the country. Behind the scenes, an enormous collection of software systems was coordinating all of it. Some systems tracked inventory moving between fulfillment centers, others managed product listings and recommendations, with separate services handling payments, customer accounts, order processing, and delivery routing. As the company expanded, more and more engineering teams were building new tools to help keep the operation running. But those tools weren't always designed to work together cleanly. In many cases, engineers simply connected their systems directly to another team's database. If one service needed information, it would just reach into another system and retrieve it. At a smaller scale, that kind of shortcut was manageable, but as Amazon grew larger, the shortcuts began creating serious problems. Changing one system could unexpectedly break another. Engineers had difficulty understanding how different pieces of the platform interacted, and deploying new features became slower and riskier because almost any modification could ripple unpredictably across the company's system. For a business whose entire operation depended on software, that kind of fragility was dangerous. So Amazon imposed a radical rule across its engineering teams. Every internal system had to expose its capabilities through standardized rules known as Application Programming Interfaces, or in other words, APIs. From that point forward, teams were no longer allowed to access each other's databases directly. If one system needed information from another, it had to request it through an API. This forced Amazon to reorganize itself. Instead of one big interconnected system, the company gradually turned its software into hundreds of smaller services that communicated with each other in a consistent way. At first, this shift solved an internal engineering problem, but over time, it created something else entirely. Once Amazon's internal systems were separated into independent services, those services no longer needed to exist inside of Amazon. They could theoretically be used by other companies as well. Amazon had already done something similar once before. A few years earlier, it had opened its retail platform to outside sellers through the marketplace. Now, the company was beginning to consider opening its computing infrastructure as well. In 2006, that idea became a real product. Amazon introduced a new service called Amazon Web Services, or AWS. Rather than building expensive server rooms of their own, companies could now simply rent computing power from Amazon's data centers. This new model became known as cloud computing. Their first service was called S3, which allowed developers to store huge amounts of data in Amazon's data centers. Soon after, Amazon released EC2, which allowed software to run on virtual machines hosted inside those same facilities. To many engineers, this solved a frustrating problem that had existed for years. Before cloud computing, launching a website or online service required buying hardware long before it was actually needed. Servers had to be installed in specialized facilities and maintained by technical staff even when traffic was low. If a new product suddenly became popular and attracted millions of users, the company might not have enough hardware to handle the demand. But if traffic stayed small, those expensive machines would sit idle. AWS changed everything. Instead of purchasing infrastructure, companies could now simply rent it. If demand suddenly increased, they could instantly scale up their computing capacity. If traffic dropped, they could scale back down and stop paying for resources they no longer needed. Computing power had effectively become a utility, and once that option existed, developers adopted it quickly. Startups began launching entire companies on AWS without needing to build their own data centers. Large tech companies migrated parts of their infrastructure into Amazon's cloud, and everything from streaming platforms, mobile apps, and enterprise software increasingly relied on the same networks of Amazon servers. Gradually, the company that had built infrastructure to run its own retail platform was now providing that infrastructure to the rest of the internet. As AWS expanded, Amazon began constructing enormous networks of data centers around the world. Inside these facilities, thousands of servers operate together to process data, store information, and run the applications modern businesses depend on. Cloud computing was only one part of a much larger system Amazon was building. While AWS powered software, the company continued expanding the physical components that moved products through its retail platform. Its logistics network grew into a complex global operation supported by cargo aircraft, regional sorting hubs, and thousands of small delivery companies operating Amazon-branded vans. Inside the company's warehouses, robotic systems began transforming how goods were handled. Mobile robots could move entire shelves of products across automated floors, reducing the distance human workers needed to walk. And new robotic arms capable of identifying and sorting individual items started assisting with packaging and distribution. At the same time as this was happening, Amazon was also quietly building another major business inside its marketplace: advertising. Brands realized that appearing at the top of Amazon search results placed their products directly in front of customers who were already looking to buy something. This allowed Amazon to build a high-margin advertising platform that generates tens of billions of dollars in revenue each year. Amazon also began investing heavily in another emerging technology: artificial intelligence. Through AWS, it was able to develop specialized chips designed to train artificial intelligence models more efficiently, allowing companies to build advanced machine learning systems at scale. New platforms such as Amazon Bedrock for building AI applications and AI assistants like Rufus, which can help shoppers in the Amazon store, were all introduced to explore how these capabilities could be integrated into the broader Amazon ecosystem. And in space, Amazon launched one of its most ambitious projects yet: a satellite internet network called Amazon Leo, designed to deploy thousands of satellites in orbit and provide global broadband activity to unserved and underserved communities. One thing is clear: Amazon isn't slowing down. Rather, it's expanding deeper and wider than ever before. So over the past few decades, Amazon has been building something far larger than a store. Businesses now rely on its marketplace to reach customers, its logistics systems move products, and its cloud infrastructure runs software all across the internet. Increasingly, they also depend on Amazon's technology to train artificial intelligence models and potentially to deliver internet connectivity from orbit. At first glance, these systems appear to belong to completely different industries: cloud computing, logistics, advertising, artificial intelligence, and even satellite internet. But they all follow the same underlying pattern. Amazon builds large-scale infrastructure and then allows other organizations to plug into those systems. So what began as a simple online store has gradually evolved into a collection of interconnected systems that literally millions of companies rely on to operate. Amazon is no longer participating in markets. Increasingly, it is shaping the systems those markets run on. And this raises a deeper set of questions about the future. Will businesses compete with Amazon, depend on Amazon, or even both at the same time? If more of the internet runs on infrastructure owned by only a few companies, how resilient is that system? And when a single company becomes the backbone of both commerce and computing, who regulates the backbone? Above all, the real question may no longer even be whether Amazon is a retailer. Instead, it's what kind of system is Amazon becoming?